Good morning, everybody. We are here opening the second semester of the master course on urban and regional planning, and we have the pleasure to have Professor James Buckley with us. He comes from MIT, from Boston University, and he's lectured on urban studies and planning. And I think it's very interesting for all of us listening what he's going to talk about, especially urban neighborhood, with a different approach and a different point of view, which is, I think, it's very necessary for us to know, because we have to change how we are doing urban regeneration today. So, thank you very much, Professor, and you are welcome.
Sure, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you to Esther, thank you to Gus, thank you for the department for inviting me. I'm here with a Fulbright grant to spend 4 months or so working with you all, learning how you're doing urban planning here and talking about how we do urban planning in the US. Now, the Fulbright grant, I was surprised. I didn't think I would get it because my Spanish is so bad. But the Fulbright people said, we want you to speak English here. They are trying to get more people to speak English. And the Spanish government is part of that program. So your government is making me speak English today, which is better than me trying to speak Spanish. But I will try not to speak too quickly. And if you don't understand something or just have a question, I welcome you interrupting and asking a question, because that's the best way to have an exchange and understand what's going on. So if you see something interesting, please just ask me about it as we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I have been doing. I started working with this kind of work. This is a housing development in San Francisco that is for very poor people, including people who have been homeless. And it is developed by a special group, a kind of group. Hard to see down here, there are 2 groups listed: Citizens Housing Corporation, where I worked, and Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, TNDC. These are groups that are not quite public and not quite private. They are NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and in the US we call them community development corporations. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how important these are, how they work in urban regeneration in our neighborhoods, and how they came to be, and compare and see if that's something that might be useful here, or why there are conditions that might make it so that it's not something that we use here in the same way. So I first came here through working with Esther, and one of your former students, Patricia Molina, was a student here, and she had a Fulbright to go to the US, and we worked together at MIT. And she said, well, the course that we're going to be working on, which is going to go into the neighborhood and think about how to do urban regeneration, is very much like the class that Ester Higueras is doing at Polytechnica. And so we hooked up and had a joint effort by blogging, by Skyping, by emailing to talk about the differences between the way that we do urban regeneration in the US and Spain. It was very interesting. And so we thought a lot about how we might work together in these ways. So I'm here now to talk about this. And so when we think about city planning in the US, there are a couple of very important things that are differences that were very apparent when the 2 groups from MIT and ETSAM worked together. So what do you think the most important thing is about city planning in the US that city planners have to consider as being very important? Any idea what you think would be the most important thing about dealing with city planning in the US, maybe versus other places? Benefits in terms of? Financial benefits?
Benefits generated from attractive conceptual district.
I'm going to come to that. I wouldn't say that's the first thing that all city planners have to deal with. Any other ideas about the U.S.? Trying to get your ideas about what the U.S. is like. I'll give you a hint. Private property. To me, this is one of the most important challenges we have as city planners. Because as I see what's going on here, as I've been to other countries, there is much less ability for planners to affect what goes on in the private market. Now, I know that you often feel like as planners, it's difficult to make things happen. You can't make other branches of the government or private parties do things. But in the US, fundamental, as you know, is the marketplace, and that you cannot interfere with other people. The individual is very important because we want individuals like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates to invent amazing things and become rich, and then we all become rich. But that doesn't work very well for communities because then we're not focusing on how everyone gets an opportunity. And as a result, we wind up as kind of like cowboys. Cowboys like Ronald Reagan, who became a legend because he really believed this idea that all of us have to do our own thing and the government shouldn't do very much. So ever since Ronald Reagan, we've been doing less and less with government, and I know you're feeling the same thing in Spain, but this is sort of an ideal for Americans, and you see it in our struggles politically today. All those Republicans who just became in charge of our Congress don't want to spend any money on cities, don't want to spend any money on city planning. So this is part and parcel of what we do and what we have to push against as planners, and this idea of a community development corporation, a private entity like the kind I worked for, the NGO, has become an important way in which we do some city planning in terms of urban regeneration. Okay, let me spend a little bit of time talking about the history of city planning and what it means and how we came to be involved with some of these NGOs. This is a picture of Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of President John F. Kennedy, in the 1960s, and he went to a very poor neighborhood in New York called Bedford-Stuyvesant, and he helped develop this idea that we can't just have official government planning and private firms. We need something in between. Sometimes we call it the third sector, the nonprofit sector, entities that will take public money and private money and go ahead and do some of the work that needs to be done without being a government entity on their own. How did this come about? This is not the kind of city planning that developed over time in the US. You know that in the 19th century, the industrial cities were very difficult. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a very industrial city. It's cleaned up now, but even when I was growing up, there were steel mills. It was dirty, bad housing, very difficult conditions. So the first city planners in the US were trying to deal with these conditions. They were trying to deal with the private market. They were trying to make private owners do better things. And they did that by convincing the government that if you had rules that prevented pollution, had wider streets, you'd be better off. But it wasn't about helping poor people. It was about improving the physical condition of cities. That was the focus of city planning from the beginning. And that continued as cities grew. So New York, in the 19-teens, begins having huge skyscrapers. The skyscrapers being built here, this is the Equitable Building, shutting out air and light. And private entities said, well, this is not good. We have to regulate what people are doing. So we developed the idea of zoning, borrowed from Germany and other European countries, and decided what would be built where and how the city should look physically. So again, it's not about helping poor people, it's about how the city works and making it more efficient. These, by the way, are the areas of how tall the buildings could be and which areas could be commercial and which areas could be residential. That was the very early zoning regulation in New York City in 1916. Then city planners became very involved with master planning. And these are two plans by a famous city planner in the US, John Nolan, who would go to these communities and say, you need a zoning regulation plan, you need a master plan of what goes where, how you're going to work this out. So cities would hire individual planners until they began to incorporate these functions into their own city government, and we began to get city government planning, again, focused on the physical aspects of the city, traffic, congestion, those types of things. How about the federal government? I know your federal government does not necessarily make a lot of rules about urban policy. The regions often are the ones that deal with this. Same in the US. We have not very often had a national urban policy. We let the states and the cities pretty much do their own thing. However, in the Depression, we finally began to think that the urban problems were too great. Here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is visiting the site of a new town. This is not something we do a lot in the US through public means. Usually private people will build a new community. But in the 1930s, things were so bad, the federal government sponsored new towns like Greenbelt, Maryland, that were based on Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea. Go outside of the city, build a community that has jobs and housing, less congestion, have it be close to a greenbelt. But there were only 3 of those projects ever started. After World War II, all of that went away. So again, the US government was not involved in urban policy, and cities were left on their own to figure these issues out. Okay, finally in the US, we do what other countries have been doing for a long time in dealing with the problems of really poor neighborhoods by building public housing. London, England was doing public housing long before many other countries. Only because of the Depression and because the government wanted to put people to work building these buildings were we ever going to have public housing. And we began to import European modernism. And so, for example, this project in New York took out several blocks of poor quality housing with a new superblock development. And it was a very foreign idea to us. And it's an idea that didn't work very well, as you know, so that many of our public housing developments became places people didn't want to live, and places that became very poorly maintained, and in fact have been torn down often because they were so difficult and so bad. But it was an early attempt to try to figure out how to improve the conditions of a neighborhood that had many poor people, many poor houses, many bad conditions, and it was one way we did this. Here's another example of a smaller one in San Francisco in terms of making this work. So again, the government is beginning to think about how do we get involved with issues of poverty? How do we deal with some of these things and not interrupt what's going on in the market and letting people do their own thing? So something that we don't think about enough or realize enough is that the real planning that went on in the US after World War II really focused on producing sprawl, producing suburban development that spread out across the city. And I don't think planners really thought, oh, we're doing this thing. Much of this was through the kinds of incentives or benefits that you're talking about, because the government gave people low interest loans to move out of the city. They built freeways that were truly free for people to drive out to. And they had many other ways in which they encouraged Americans to move out to the suburbs, people who could afford to do so. And so we spread the cities out, and we had people living far away from their jobs, more cars driving, less ability to get around, very poor accessibility if you weren't going to drive. And this was really the issue that was driving a lot of what our cities look like today, because not necessarily on purpose, but through these different programs, we began to think about having less dense cities and moving people out into the urban edge. The result was very bad for the inner city. The people that had the money, the upper and middle classes, moved out of the city. Very typical in US situation that people who had any money were able to move out of the city, and they left behind people who didn't have very much money at all. And so cities were poor, they did not have the services, they began to decline further, and that's when a new type of city planning develops, urban renewal. And here's an example of one in Boston. This is low density, but, well, not low density, it's a low level neighborhood, low buildings, an Italian and Jewish neighborhood, people not very wealthy at all. It's right next door to downtown Boston and to Beacon Hill. So in the 1950s, planners were concerned that this neighborhood was unhealthy. It had many indicators that said people were underweight or under income or different kinds of things that were a problem. And their approach was to tear the whole thing down. And this was very much, of a time that people did very large redevelopment projects, and they tried to rework the city, rebuild the city, not work from within, but to do a very top-down, government-oriented, government-pushed project. The federal government again stepped in and said, cities are a problem. The federal government needs to help these communities change. And so they paid to have the city properties acquired and torn down, and cities could start over again with that aspect and doing it. But they destroyed many communities in doing this, and they destroyed many communities that were not typical. They were communities that were poor, they were ethnic, and they were people who didn't have much of a voice. And this is critical because it began the process of changing how we do city planning in the US. This is a turning point when we had projects like this. This is a promotion for urban renewal in San Francisco. This is the existing city. It's dark, oscuro, it's black. Bad things happen in the city. Here's the new city we're going to put right down on top of it. It's got light and air. You know the story. This is Le Corbusier again. And the idea was that we could just fix the cities by making new cities. And who was going to live in these cities? It was going to be people who were middle class, people who might be thinking about moving to the suburbs. No, we want to keep them in San Francisco, and they could walk to all of these beautiful amenities, and they could be part of this community. That we've taken out the old city and built this pretty new city in place of it. But what happened to all those people who were living here? They just pushed out, they had nowhere to go, and it led to many protests. And you probably know the story of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in New York, where this got the most publicity, but this kind of struggle went on constantly. Robert Moses, who was the expert at urban renewal and acquiring properties, putting in freeways, parks, new skyscraper complexes, and people being pushed out of their homes as a result. And Jane Jacobs, being someone who lived in a neighborhood in Greenwich Village, saying, this isn't right. We live here, we understand this is a good neighborhood. You don't understand, you're coming from somewhere else, you have some big idea of how cities should work. People who live in neighborhoods should have a say in how this works. You should understand what happens at a small scale. You should appreciate that I know all my neighbors. I can see out on my street and see who's playing. I know the shop owners. We have a community here. This is very important. And Jane Jacobs, in her work, changed the way planners thought. She was so avid in her advocacy that planners were doing it wrong, that she helped people decide, well, we've got to do this differently. If we have the big idea, that may not be the best thing for everyone in every neighborhood, and so planning began to change. But there's another big aspect of American society that's very important in considering city planning. I won't keep you in suspense this time. It's something that we deal with all the time that may be a little bit different from here and from other places, and that is our issues of race and ethnicity. And this permeates American society completely, and you've been hearing a lot about it more recently with the African Americans who have been shot by policemen, white policemen. These kinds of issues have been going on for a very long time. And they make people think very hard about what they're doing in terms of making communities. And people who are of minority status often want to cling to their identity, push the fact that they have that identity and they want to be part of things against the majority society in the US. And one of the ways that they've done that, well, they started by doing that in the 1960s through the rioting in urban areas, the urban crisis, that made people aware of how difficult it was to live in these communities that were left behind when the suburbs developed, people with more money left, life in the city was very difficult, and people finally rioted to say, this isn't working. Again, the US government stepped in. We had big programs to try to help cities, the Great Society, but again, they were very top-down. They were run by government entities. They did not have a lot of local participation. So part of the response to these kinds of writing was to put in place an idea of how people could participate more directly in city planning and other urban issues. Let me get a little bit teacherly here, a little bit academic, and think about some of the aspects that this led to this. So we know that there are many different politics involved in city planning, and here's one way in which some people, the Feinsteins who are at Harvard, have thought about how to organize our thoughts about planning. And they have traditional, democratic, equity planning, incremental planning. This is an American matrix, things that we've thought of. And the idea is who plans, the type of process for planning, and the objectives that we undertake when we do those kinds of planning. And basically, these three are critiques of the main way in which planners do planning. And when you people ask you, what does a planner do? You say, well, a planner thinks about how the city works and thinks about logical things we could do to make the city better. And these three ways of thinking question this, because so many times we think, oh, we're planners. We think in rational ways about how to make things better. And this rational, almost scientific approach is something that's been really criticized, that people don't feel that that understands all the vague aspects, all the variations of how people think about things in the world. So in the 1960s, people began to react against Le Corbusier, Robert Moses, the top-down, rational, scientific way of thinking about cities, and began to have other ways of thinking about it. The democratic process would be one in which people can speak out and push their own interests. Everyone has interest. Everyone should have a say in how the world works. Everyone should participate in what happens. And the process, how you go through the making of a decision, the process is more important than the result. And planners in the US are very process-oriented now as a result. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to get everyone together in a community. What is it that they want? How can we get those things done? And there's a lot of struggle over that. But very rarely do we have situations in which the government decides, we want to do this, we're going to go do that kind of thing. Planners are not able to do that in the same way anymore. Of course, we have equity approaches. This, again, comes out of the 1960s. The idea that planners should advocate on behalf of certain communities. If you have a community that is an immigrant community, they don't have much money, they don't have the language skills, there should be a planner that helps them understand the process, how they should be able to access resources, how they should be able to participate in the process. So this is a very different way of thinking about it, that you provide them almost like an advocate or a lawyer to help them argue their case. And finally, we have incremental planning. Some of you might know, we have a very young planner in the back. Get them early, this is good, I like that. You might know Lindblom, who is famous for saying, planners don't know everything. They think they know everything, but they don't. And all planners can do is take little steps. Take a step, see how it goes, okay. Take another step, see how that goes. So these are three critiques of how planning had been done in the US for many, many years. And one way in which this is, here they are again. So pluralistic, process matters, urban growth machine, look for the money, see who has the most money. That's how planning gets done. Participation and protest, advocacy and equity planning. And here's one of the best known ways in which this is expressed. This is from an article that is the most read article in the biggest planning journal in the US, the Journal of American Planning Association. This article is the most read because people are very interested in Sherry Arnstein's ideas of what is participation. She thinks about it in different ways. You can have no one participating. You're just getting information. Thank you very much. Go right ahead and do what you want to do. You could be consulted. We don't think that's a good idea. Too bad, we're going to do it anyway. And you can go all the way up to scale until people have actual control of what goes on. And so in her article, she talks about these different ways in which people might be able to be part of the planning process or not. And it's become, even though we don't always do it very well, planning in the US today has to involve people in the process. They might be further down this scale. It might be just informing. But more often, it's more like a partnership and people have a say in what goes on. And in fact, in San Francisco, where I live most of the time, it's very, very liberal, and everyone feels like they should have a say about what goes on. And as a result, nothing happens. Because everyone says, I don't like that, I don't like that. Everyone gets to have a turn. It goes on forever and ever and ever. So that's not good either. Having too much participation is not good. But not having enough is also a problem, as we've seen. And here is a chart that one of my colleagues at MIT put together of how a model of planning process in the US, define the problem, map the stakeholder interests. Stakeholder is a very key word. All of the interested parties. The people who live there, the people who work there, the government, the people who might have money who invested there, institutions who were involved in that community. All these people have to be brought together to have a planning process that works correctly in the US. Analyze the situation, engage stakeholders, seek agreement, have people come together, implement changes, reflect, encourage public learning. I don't know if you talk about this idea here at all, but in the US, planners are very interested in this idea of communicative planning. Does anyone know communicative planning? Has anyone studied Habermas? Oh, good, good, good. I find it kind of annoying, personally. But people are so interested in this process that they have now adopted ideas of Habermas, the German philosopher, who believes if we just really communicate, communication is the key. If everyone puts in honest, straightforward answers, we can come up with the best answers. And so planners are trying to implement these kinds of ideas, and they're even more focused on the process of planning and less focused on the result. I don't suggest this route. I like more results. I like building things and making things happen. On the other hand, we do have to think about how people communicate and what goes on. So I'll be interested to hear, as I learn about what's going on in Spain, what kinds of avenues you have for participation here and how it might work. Okay, how does this play out in terms of the kind of work that I have done as a planner in the US? These organizations called community development corporations are everywhere. Every city has them. Some have many, some have a few. Here's one of the first ones. It's very famous because it's in the San Francisco area where it's hard to build. And they put together a whole new neighborhood, essentially, with shops that local immigrants can work in or have a business in, low-income housing for seniors so they can stay in the community. It's all at a train station where people who may or may not be part of the community can buy things, can come and be part of that community. So it's a very successful effort for a nonprofit group, community-based, based in that neighborhood, to come together and say, we want these things, and to get the resources to make that actually get built. But we have many kinds of these groups. We have very small ones. Some are just based in a neighborhood and only do work in that neighborhood, and they may do 1 or 2 projects every few years. Others, like Bridge Housing, where I first worked, based in San Francisco, works all across the Western US, builds thousands of units, builds grocery stores, community centers, all those sorts of things. So that is to say that community development corporations, nonprofit groups, are a key aspect of urban generation in the US. They're not big enough to solve all the problems, but they're one route to say, here's how a community can be part of what goes on, have a way to talk about what the issues are, and actually implement them, and maybe have some kind of control over what goes on. We have many resources now that can be used to make these kinds of things work. So it gets back to the benefits and what kinds of things we offer to people to make happen. In the 1970s, the federal government decided people are complaining too much. We don't want to do urban renewal. We don't want to do big programs. We are going to make money available to local governments to do what they want for city planning. This is called Community Development Block Grants. It's a very important program. It keeps getting cut back. But it's basically money with some restrictions that cities can use in different ways. If you want to fix up a shopping district, you can use it to make the sidewalks nicer, improve the stores that are there. If you want to build housing, you can use it to build housing. The idea is that the federal government has the money, it gives it to local governments to use as they see fit. This is one way that you can do this aspect. These are tax credits. These are investments that the federal government says, we don't want to write checks for these projects. We want to encourage private investment. So for example, the project I started with got an investment from a big corporation to build that building that I showed because the federal government gave them a tax break for doing so. The federal government did not write the check, the corporation did, but the federal government did not get the tax money over 10 years. It's a very important resource that we have because the federal government, as most governments feel, does not want to put the money in directly. So this is one way in which you do this. The new markets tax credit, same thing for commercial development. If your neighborhood does not have a good grocery store and you want to try to get better services, you can use this to attract a grocery store and put that in place. And the community development corporations either do this themselves or they're partners with other groups that do this kind of work. We also have private entities that support what goes on. Foundations, charitable groups, but we have 3 large organizations that are basically nonprofits themselves, super big nonprofits that provide money and assistance to smaller nonprofits across the country. We now have what are called community development investment funds. These are like banks that are for this kind of activity. They're huge. They've become very, very big as some of our banks. And they take money in from private investors, and they put that money into housing, grocery stores, community centers, all these kinds of needs. So these are a different way in which we do this. And finally, community land trusts are an important aspect increasingly because this is where the nonprofit entity acquires the land and owns the land for all time, and people can do different things on top of it, affordable housing, and et cetera. So these are some of the aspects, some of the ways that we try to use community development corporations to make these work. Here's an example of one of those super big nonprofits. Enterprise is a group that provides all these things. They invest tax credits, they provide consulting, they provide grants, they provide loans, they provide equity. All of these things are something that these groups do, and so community development corporations can work with them on this aspect of it. Here's an example in San Diego. A very troubled neighborhood, a Latino neighborhood in San Diego. The people came together with a foundation. They acquired property. They built their own shopping center. They own it. The Community Development Corporation owns it and determines who will be in there. They built housing at the train station. It's hard to see here, but they have what they call a graffiti shop for the kids where they can get their creative juices going by having an art seminar within that as well. So the group, in this case, again, doing the actual development, creating it, owning it over time, and managing it. Here's a project I've been involved with in San Francisco, where Japantown is an important neighborhood that is a symbol of the Japanese culture in San Francisco for a long time. It's been threatened by new development, so people came together to develop a new plan that uses the Japanese cultural identity and some of those aspects as a way to organize, as a way to try to keep those elements, keep people in the neighborhood and keep it from changing entirely. They want new investment, but they want to maintain the identity of Japantown on its own. These are some of the examples of the kinds of ways in which people are implementing this aspect. Okay, I'm going to go on to talk about the specifics that we did with the studio with Esther's class. But let me pause for a second to take a glass of refreshing water and ask if there are particular questions or comments or suggestions or anything that you were thinking about as I go through this. Can you understand me? Yes, good. I'm trying to go slow. But I've decided that people in Madrid speak faster than anybody else. You're very quick. So, do you have a question, Manuel?
No. In this last example that you gave to us, the website of the enterprise, for example, how can equity can be offered to
this one or the one before?
The previous one.
Yeah.
Previous one. Yeah, this one.
How can equity be offered?
I mean, how can you can actually address equity in this kind of frameworks? I mean, what's they just give like innovative solutions, or is it kind of a consultancy, or?
Mm-hmm. There's many different ways, and this word equity means many things. So equity in many ways means ownership, and that's one of the most important aspects, that through the Community Development Corporation, the neighborhood can own the development. If they get the money and they buy the property, they legally own it, and so it has a board of directors. It also has members often from the community who decide what should happen with it. So this idea of equity is that you have control over what goes on. It also means financial equity, in which you might get the money, you might get a loan, but you need some money to bring to that loan to complete the transaction. It might be that kind of equity as well. So it means many different things, but the reason I think that it's worked well is that it gives people in those neighborhoods a sense of ownership of what goes on. And that's not some outside entity, whether it's governmental or a private corporation. They know who's running it, they can go to them. They might even be able to fire the manager if they're upset about that kind of thing. So equity in that case means ownership. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, maybe there'll be some more as I talk about the specifics, because it was very interesting as we began to do our work together and think about the differences. So we worked with a group called Viet Aid, which is an organization like the Japantown group. It represents a lot of immigrants to the US who came to the US in this case after the Vietnam War was over, and since then we've had a lot of immigration from various places, and this group is involved. Now, in working together with the group here, we had very few architects in our group, and planning in the US is very different. Planning is often done not by architects at all. Some planning schools are not even attached to an architecture department. I don't think that's right. I like being at MIT where there's architecture and planning together, because you need all those aspects. But one of the things that we did, we had economists, sociologists, people in various fields bringing their ideas to how we would work with this group. So here's the Vietnamese group thinking about what is our identity, how do we tell our story, how can we increase our own sense of involvement and ownership and being part of the community by telling our own stories. They have education programs, but they're also a group that goes out and acquires property and does some of these kinds of developments. So you know Boston, in the snow zone up there, buried in snow right now, in New England. And downtown Boston, the place you always know about, here's MIT across the river, Harvard up here. This is the red line of the metro, and it's all the way down here in the south part of the city. This part, Dorchester and Roxbury, are where a lot of minorities have settled over time, inexpensive housing and land, and it's one of the poorest areas. So if we're talking about urban regeneration, we need to focus on these areas and figure out how we can help them improve without displacing them and creating a problem for them as we have in other planning programs in the past. People are very worried about displacement. We want to help people. We do not want to create really nice communities that suddenly people with money move in and push those people out. That's a problem in some of these communities that have high-tech development like San Francisco, Boston, and New York. So what does Viet Aid as a CDC, a Community Development Corporation, do? They do a variety of things, but one of them is to assess what the needs are. So they have many different kinds of development, many kinds of buildings in this community. They have triple deckers, which are a Boston standard kind of house, very dense because it's 3 units on a small lot. They also have smaller buildings, they have shops, and here they've built their own apartment complex as well. So we have a mix of kinds of buildings in this community. And we began our study by determining where the study is, what our areas were, and what we were trying to figure out. This circle represents something that is becoming more and more important to planners in the US. You have got a great transportation system here in Madrid. You can get anywhere. Boston has one of the better ones in the US. Even then, it's not that good because we have spread out. We do not have real dense locations. So one of the things that we are focused on now is trying to build denser around train stations. So this circle means we are close to the train station, we should increase our density and do more development in those areas. How do we think about these issues? It's become common in city planning in the US to talk about 3 E's: environment, economy, and equity. We are concerned about climate change. We're concerned about trying to make sure that our cities can grow and people have opportunities. We are also concerned, back to the idea of equity, that everyone has an opportunity to be part of those things. So we talk about this triangle, and the point for our program was not just to focus on how we could improve the economic situation there, how could we contribute to a better environmental situation? Less pollution, less driving, more accessibility for people, better water quality, use less energy. All of those are tied together, but they're hard to do. Usually we do them separately, and we were trying to figure out how we could do both these things together. This was then translated into the ideas of sustainability, livability, and affordability, as to what our goals would be for trying to make improvements in the neighborhood. And it became part of this symbol, this icon. So we want to have economic opportunity. We want to have that within a context of social equity, but of course we want to be thinking about the environmental context overall. So all of our policies should involve all of these elements as a multi-part goal for our development. And so each of the actions that the students chose to take or to promote in the neighborhood deals with economic opportunity, social equity, inclusiveness, environmental health, and liability. And the idea was that our client, Viet Aid, as the Community Development Corporation, has all of these many things it could do. And it's remarkable how many opportunities there are for community development corporations, but they have to choose. You can't do all of those things all the time. So our goal was to help them figure out which things were most important. So our plan for the neighborhood involved existing housing, new housing, economic development, and working on the public realm. So our existing housing, we did an assessment of what was there, what kind of condition it was, who lived where, what their income levels were, who might need help. And so as a result, we thought about cutting their energy costs, thought about the problem of people living away from the housing and not taking good care of it, and thinking about how to improve the environment. There's a lot of, in many of these wooden houses, People used lead paint many years ago, paint with a lot of lead content. That's very dangerous, especially for small children. So we had to think about ways to get rid of that lead paint and improve the environmental quality. We did our typical strengths and weaknesses analysis. What are the strengths of Viet-Aid's position? What are the issues that they need to be thinking about? Opportunities, issues, risks. What were things that happen? Again, the potential for gentrification is a concern in a place like Boston, because if you make a lot of improvements and the place becomes a place a lot of people want to come to, it becomes a concern and people might be in danger of losing their home. One approach that Viet-Aid as an organization might take is expressed here. We have many, many programs that people might take advantage of and they get confused. Maybe Viet-Aid could be a center for all the energy efficiency programs that Boston and Massachusetts offer. So if you were a homeowner, you have one place to go to take advantage of ways to improve your house, improve your heating system, make different kinds of improvements over time. So Viet-Aid could act as a community center for these many programs. New housing, opportunities, lower housing costs for people, social equity and inclusiveness, and environmental health and livability. So again, these three areas we're thinking about how we can be part of it, have Viet-Aid help them do that. So in the short term, we thought about trying to find sites for them to acquire. So this gets back to the equity issue that Viet-Aid often can find the resources to go out and actually buy that property, build the housing they want to build, and control it over time so they have more community control. And long term, here's what they're doing. They've done this with new affordable housing with shops down below. I'm on hold. What do you think? Let me pause again and ask if this is making any interest to you or anything in particular that might be relevant or completely irrelevant for the Spanish setting. Do we have things like this here? Do you have these kinds of groups? No? Okay. Do you see any possibility that this would be useful? Or is it completely an American crazy kind of thing? Think about it. Those of us in the workshop will have a chance to think about that some more. Great. Are we set? Good. Thank you. Okay. So one approach the students took would be to survey all of the property in the neighborhood that might be available for that organization to acquire and narrow it down to which would be the best ones to do. So identify for the nonprofit group where they should focus their interest. With this kind of data and information, and these investigations, which ones would be the best ones to do, how to finance that, how to get the debt and equity to acquire it, and to make that housing a reality. Economic development, also important. For these same reasons, environmental health, social equity, economic opportunity, identifying where the jobs are, where people might have an opportunity, which are the sites that are underserved, so that we might get more opportunities for jobs in those locations, where they might be parcels for them to acquire or encourage other people to acquire, what the real estate situation would be that they might be able to make that kind of thing work. So our role as planners was to provide the nonprofit with information about how they might be able to act in good ways in that community and make these kinds of projects work in a better way. Finally, something that very familiar as planners, the public realm, public spaces, and here we did have our architects working on this, thinking about how some of these spaces worked or didn't work. Area around the train station very poorly designed for circulation, so trying to find ways in which you could encourage connections as people come off the train, that they might go to stores, that there might be more opportunities for dense housing nearby, so more people would take the train and fewer people would drive. public spaces, alleyways that might be fixed up, long-term solutions. One of the things that planners in the US are very concerned about is the quality of roads and the fact that we have let automobiles run everything in our cities. So how can we take away some of the space that's given over to autos to have opportunities to have wider sidewalks, green spaces, green infrastructure, all those aspects. But this is long term. This is something that you have to think way into the future for. But the neighborhood was interested in these ideas and wanted to make this work over time and think about how it could be implemented. Okay, so our conclusion, envisioning a vibrant, diverse, and sustainable fields corner. That's the neighborhood where VET works within this vision. So the idea is that VET could help develop the neighborhood vision. It could find actors to work with to make this work. It could do things right away to improve the neighborhood. It could also think about long-range planning. It could encourage public and private actors to join with them. And it could be the vehicle for getting people to participate in that planning process over time. Well, what happened? Planners are often disappointed when plans, you put a lot of effort into it and they don't get implemented. Well, in this case, we were very fortunate that this man right here is showing us around the neighborhood. He turned out to be a state legislator from the neighborhood, and lo and behold, the following year, he was elected the new mayor, the new alcalde of Boston. So he remembers that he took us on this trip, and he said, let's implement that plan that those MIT students, that was a really good plan, let's do that. So it was a very good circumstance that we happened to have the new mayor be part of the process. And they're working on many of the proposals now. It takes a long time, as you know, but it was nice to see that the work that we had done actually got listened to and was something that people are working on now. And I'll point out, it's hard to see, here's Patricia Molina in the background there. So she was there, she was part of the program, and she was really key to help us make this work. So the idea now, and here's an example of comparing to what the students here did, physically oriented, public realm kinds of issues, and it was nice to see that contrast. And we learned a great deal from their ability to do energy studies, solar studies. We were quite amazed at the things they could do. This is the kind of exchange that's great to learn about how people do things differently. Okay, so the idea is that we do sustainable and equitable neighborhood revitalization. I'm very excited to be here this semester. We'll be working in the Embajadores neighborhood in the workshop, which has many of these same elements of different social mixes, very dense area. One of the things we've talked about is that often as planners, we talk about new places, building new green, sustainable cities. The biggest problem is working in areas that are already built out, and we have so many of those. How can we make those areas more equitable and more sustainable? So that is our challenge. And what's exciting to me is we face so many of the same challenges. We all face global issues, global money moving around. We face immigration issues. We have to work together and find ways to do this. So I'm very happy to be here today and into the future. And so I'll stop here and see if there are conversations we might begin today, questions, issues we might talk about, and move on from there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any questions? Well, I have one first question about the VET association. Do they have money to pay your work, to deliver, to pay the lot and to build a house? How does it work?
I know I made it sound so good. There's these groups and they just make all these things happen. No, the money does not just happen. The money takes a lot of work. But why I went through the history of it is that there was money to tear down that neighborhood in Boston, and people objected and said, no, we want money to work on our own. So some of that money is available for these kinds of groups. It might be that CDBG money I talked about. It might be local tax money. It might be investment from the group you asked about, all the different things that they do. So part of the problem for these groups is they have to be entrepreneurs. they don't just get a budget, figure out what to do, they have to go find the site, they have to go find the money, they have to get their neighbors to go to the place and say, we all want this money. So part of the important work is to get the money. And that often gets in the way of the planning process and development process. But there have been many groups who have found ways to make this work and get some things done. So thank you for asking that key question, where is the money? It doesn't just come, but groups are doing enough to find the ways to make that resource happen. It's very important. Yeah.
And another question. This is a Vietnam community, but I think they are not alone. There will be another type of community. Do they speak with the others, or they take the rule of the neighborhood? Or?
Yes, another key question, that we have many different groups. And so part of the problem is, how do the groups work together? Yes, of course there's tension, as you mentioned. This is also a neighborhood with many African Americans, many Latinos, Cape Verdean, Haitian. There are many different groups there. And so one of the reasons that VET 8 is successful, maybe because they're so different or they're newer, they've said, we like everybody. What do we all want to do? So they make sure that all kinds of people can live in their housing, all kinds of people come to their meetings, all kinds of people, not to say there aren't tensions, but it's an interesting aspect of how they make this work. So sometimes these groups represent one group and they aren't as successful, and sometimes they're able to bring a lot of different groups together into one. But it's a big challenge for these kinds of entities. Good questions. Yeah, you had a question.
Do you think this community development cooperation system can be applied or could be applied, since it starts in the 70s, in other countries with a different situation, different cultures? Because it seems so connected with American culture and economic and also.
That's a really good question, and one I'm interested in thinking about here, because Canada has some of this, England has some of this, but I think it is pretty particular to our system, and part of it is that it's grown over time. We had the 60s urban crisis, we had different ways of doing things, we had Ronald Reagan moving all the programs out of the government, and so we had people in the community who said, we want to do something, let's make this work. And then you have all those groups, enterprise, you have foundations who are used to this. So there is now a pretty good infrastructure for supporting these small groups all over the country. That would be hard to replicate. People have talked about doing this in China, and the political situation is so different, it seems impossible to make this kind of thing work. Even though they have a lot of participation in various ways, this doesn't seem to work. I don't know in Spain. Maybe there's enough interest or enough people would think about it because there are so few alternatives that it might be something people try and build their own system. So I don't know the answer, but I'd be interested to find out what people think about it and whether it's worth thinking about here. Okay? Other questions? Concerns? Issues? Yes?
This example of the community development, let's say that after the process, it's, okay, they succeed and they build their own shopping mall, let's say, all right? Who is the owner? I mean, who actually holds the ownership?
Yes, that's a very good question.
It's an association,
yes.
It's a group of individuals, each one is an individual. Is it in any ways, let's say, protected from the market?
Yes, yes, yes. So let me, that's a key, and this may get to your question about why it only happens in the US. This is a very obscure reference, but it's very critical. This is a part of the tax code in the US that allows a group like this to have its own existence. It is tax exempt, but it is a public benefit corporation. So it's not a public entity, it's not part of the government, but it's not totally private either because it's a public benefit corporation. So the tax law, it figures that taxes would run everything in our system. So tax law says you have to do certain things. You cannot distribute money to people who are part of the organization. It all has to go into the organization. You do not have to pay federal taxes unless you do something like own a business. And it allows you to have an organization that is its own entity and can own property and businesses in that way. So it'd be that kind of thing. The only thing I might compare it to is Mondragon co-op kind of things, co-op development. It might be kind of like that in some ways, but it's very particular to what we do in the US. Yeah?
In urban retrofitting in the United States,
Yes.
profit is very important. And this repeats also in the retrofitting of shopping malls. But these profits are used to come at long term. That is true. Is this trend the main in urban retrofitting, the searching of profits?
Using the profits to improve the community, is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
That's very...
Searching of profits.
Yes.
If the last aim of urban retrofitting is profits.
If that's a preference for using the profits is a preference for that? Is that your question? Yeah. Help me, I'll start and you tell me if I'm answering the question. So one of the aspects that we have, that I think most countries have, is taxing the profits to improve the community. And we have redevelopment law in the US in many places, and like you, different places have different, there's not one national situation. But often we will use, if a shopping mall does well, hopefully the profits from that can be taxed to use to improve the community around it. It's very controversial, but it's something we're still working with. And in California, 2 years ago, they got rid of the whole thing. It was not being used well, so they ended that practice entirely. So different communities have different ways of doing that sort of thing, but it can be a very important resource for urban regeneration.
It is because in Belmar retrofitting in Denver, the main goal were the profits is to make a derelict or non-profitable shopping mall and that mall into a vibrant community which can produce profits because of retail activity and real estate improvements. Real estate activity also.
But that kind of thing is controversial because I'll go back to my first point. Many people then say, why are these groups doing that? This is a private market and a private entity should do that kind of thing. So often we bump up against people who say, this is just socialism, we don't want this. We want it to be private market doing these kinds of things. That Denver Mall is a good example of that, but often people will complain that that's not really what we should be doing as nonprofit groups. Good question. Yes?
I don't know if you talk about the real time, but what time do you use to do it? What time do you use to do it?
What time?
Yes.
How long does it take?
Yes.
So it takes often 4 or 5 years to get one of these things completed. So it's not right away, and it depends on all the things that you asked about in terms of money. You may get enough money to buy the property, then you wait 2 years to get more money to build it, and then you have it open. So often these things take some time, and part of the problem is the group has to keep going while they're waiting until there's money from the development. So all of this has to be thought through very carefully, and it's why the infrastructure for supporting these groups is important, so they have some money over time while they're waiting for this process to go through. But it can vary. Sometimes projects will take 10 years, but usually take 3, 4, 5 years to get something done. Okay? Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Yes?
Are there any social issues in these proposals as well? We are focused on physical interventions, but are there any social or, I don't know, educational or other kind of issues altogether?
Good.
I'm biased toward the physical also, so there are many of those kinds of things. For example, in the Japantown case, well, you saw the Viet Aid telling their stories, a cultural project. In Japantown, they're trying to identify all the aspects of Japanese culture that have been there over time. Temples, places where festivals were held, where people lived, and to mark those as a heritage area and be able to tell that story over time. So they might have a website that includes all the information. They might have a walking trail that tells you about that. So there are social and educational aspects of these things too. You might have to get special funds or raise money for that sort of a thing, but they're able to do that sort of thing too. So it's not just the physical shopping center housing, it's also things that educate the community and do that as well. Okay. Well, thanks for letting me talk about this. I'm obviously very excited about it, so I look forward to talking with people here and learning about what you're doing in urban planning in this country and sharing what we know from the US as well. So thank you so much. Great. All right. Thanks.